So let's start for real. I will share the actually, yeah, I'll share the sources on screen, and I'll also put them in the chat. Can I still access the chat while I'm screen sharing? I don't even know. Yes, I can. And if you're watching or listening to this at some point in the future, you can email me at deborahklapper@gmail.com for the sources. And I see that Arvei Chessis is here to help us with the video recording tonight. We also have a, I've also been making voice recordings all along. But tonight, hopefully we'll also have a video recording like we're supposed to. Okay, so we are continuing the Gemara from last week. And the first thing I need to do is apologize that I made a mistake last week, which is to say that when we spoke about the dispute about whether you fulfill your obligation of Kiddush with the Kiddush that's made in Shul, I mistranslated the part about the obligation of wine. The correct translation, no reason to repeat the mistake, but the correct translation would be that the obligation of wine is the obligation to say a bracha on the wine. So when Rav said that you fulfilled your obligation of Kiddush, but you did not fulfill your obligation of wine, what he means is that you don't need to make Kiddush again when you get home, but if you're going to drink a glass of wine when you get home, you do need to make a new Bari Priya Gafen. Okay, so the our Gemara opens with a third position in that machloket. The positions that we had so far were Shmuel, who said that you'd fulfill no obligations at all. The position of Rav, that you fulfill the obligation of Kiddush, but not the obligation of the Bari Priya Gafen. And the position that we're going to have this evening is a third position, about the same people, same situation. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Af Yadei Yain Nam Yatzu. Rabbi Yochanan says that you've even fulfilled the obligation of wine, which is to say that you go to Shul, Yudaf and Mariv, somewhere in the middle of Mariv, somebody stands up on the bima with a cup of wine and makes Kiddush. You don't drink any wine. You continue davening Mariv. You walk home. You sit down to dinner. Rabbi Yochanan thinks you can start by drinking a cup of wine without making a bracha on it, and then washing and making hamotzi and eating dinner. That seems to be the situation. That is not what we do, clearly. But that seems to be what Rabbi Yochanan says. And the Gemara's, it doesn't seem to be what anyone did in the time of the Gemara either, actually. They seem a little scandalized by this. But first, we're going to analyze what Rabbi Yochanan said to understand it properly. The Azra Rabbi Yochanan Latame. Rabbi Yochanan is consistent, that is, he goes according to his usual reasoning. The Amar Rabbi Rav Chanin bar Abaye, Amar Rabbi Ptat, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. As said Rav Chanin bar Abaye, as said Rabbi Ptat, as said Rabbi Yochanan. It doesn't matter. Echad shinui yain, doesn't matter if you change the wine. The echad shinui makom, or if you changed place. Either way, you don't need to. Either way, you don't need to make a new bracha. Okay, so either somebody brought out a new bottle of wine, don't need to make a new bracha because the bracha you made on the wine you're already drinking, it covers it, or you stand up and go sit out on the patio for your dessert wine, don't need to make a new bracha there either. That seems to be the position here. And so Rabbi Yochanan had that position, and we're saying that the idea that you could make Kiddush and Shul and then walk home and drink the wine is just an extension of the idea that you can move from your living room to your patio and keep drinking without making a new bracha. It does seem to be a significantly extended extension, but it's not inconsistent. Okay, so now we're going to attempt the first of several proposed tiyuftas against Rabbi Yochanan. And so it's a good moment to review our tiyufta terminology here. So Rabbi Yochanan is an Amora, which is to say he's a rabbi from the time period of the Gemara, sometime after the 2nd century and before whenever the Babylonian Talmud closes, which is a few hundred years later, whenever that is. And the job of Amoraim is supposed to be to interpret, to explain, to elucidate the positions of the Tanaim and the text of the Torah. Also, maybe to take sides in the disputes between Tanaim. Tanaim are the rabbis of the time of the Mishnah, so anyone before the 2nd century, but after the close of Tanakh is going to be a Tana for our purposes. And the job of an Amora is not to disagree with a Tana. So, if you could prove that all of the known positions of the Tanaim disagree with the position that the Amora is taking, then the Amora would lose. And that is called a tiyufta. Right? Their position would not be a legitimate position because they have taken a position that's not allowed. But there are several ways out of this situation. One of them is, for example, if you find a different Tana who holds the same position as the Amora, then he's not disagreeing with an Amora, he's taking sides in a dispute between Tanaim. So he's not disagreeing with a Tana, he's taking sides in a dispute between Tanaim, and that's legit. Or you can decide that they're really talking about different cases, and so they have nothing to do with each other. That is by far and away the most common way to resolve tiyufta situations. Or you could decide that he didn't really mean what he said. And there are variations on all of these things. Okay, but when you see the word meitive, or you hear that we're about to have a tiyufta, what you expect after that is a Tanaitic text that contradicts the Amora that we just had. So, meitive, we have a Braita suggested as a tiyufta. Shinui makom tzarich levarech, shinui yain ein tzarich levarech. The Braita says, apparently exactly the opposite of what Rabbi Yochanan just said. If you change place, you need to make a new blessing. If you change wine, you don't need to make a new blessing. Okay, so if you bring a new bottle of wine to the table for the dessert course, then that does not necessitate a new blessing. But if you stand up and go sit in the library to drink your port after dinner, apparently you do need to make a new blessing. And that would seem very much to make impossible Rabbi Yochanan's position about Kiddush and Shul, since presumably, unless you're eating dinner in Shul, Shul is a different place than wherever it is you're eating dinner. And unlike the overwhelming majority of tiyuftas, this one is successful, at least for the moment. We'll see what happens. Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan tiyufta. Yeah, that's a tiyufta. He's out of luck. He can't say that. Okay. We'll come back to Rabbi Yochanan, hold him in your mind, but first we need to be distracted by something. Yativ Rav Idi bar Avin, kamed Rav Chisda, Yativ Rav Chisda v'ka'amar mishmei Rav Huna. So Rav Idi bar Avin was sitting in front of Rav Chisda. Generally speaking, that kind of language means that Rav Chisda is the teacher, and Rav Idi bar Avin is the student. And Rav Chisda was sitting and speaking, and he said in the name of Rav Huna, Hade amarta shinui makom tzarich levarech, lo shanu elo mibayit lebayit, aval mimakom umakom lo. So Rav Chisda says in the name of Rav Huna, this thing that we just said in the Braita that we brought to contradict Rabbi Yochanan, that if you change places, you do need to make a new bracha. That was only taught about a case where you're going from one house to another house. But if you're going from a place to place inside the same house, no. Now that seems to, on the face of it, if you look at the vocabulary, seems to be saying when we said the word makom, we didn't mean makom, we went by, which is odd because in that case, why didn't we say so? But this seems anyway to be the only accepted meaning of this text. So I don't know, maybe it sounded better. So as for what I said a few minutes ago about going out to the patio or going to the library in your house, skip that. Now we didn't mean that. What we meant was if you go across the street to your neighbor's house to have a drink at their house after dinner, then you need to make a new bracha. Please God, we should get out of this thing and we should go to each other's houses and eat and drink. Okay, so Rav Idi Bar Avin responds. Remember, he's the student in this classroom, and he says, "I'm really Rav Idi Bar Avin. Hachi tenena le b'matnita debei Rav Hinak." He says, "But wait a minute. That was taught in a braita that was taught in the house of a guy named Rav Hinak. Ve'amri la b'matnita debei Rav Hinak. Debei Bar Hinak. But either way, kavatayich." And some people say, by the way, that it was a braita that was taught by the house, not of Rav Hinak, but the son of Hinak, which it's pretty easy to switch the Reish Bet for the Bet Reish. Either way, we have a braita that was taught kavatayich, according to you, meaning saying the same thing you just said. So what we have is a rabbi from the middle of the Gemara period said an interpretation of a braita. His student raises his hand and said, "But wait a minute, we have a very old text that says the same thing you just said. Are you quoting it?" And the Gemara here interferes and says, "Vela Rav Huna matnita kamashmalan." Wait a minute, did Rav Huna just teach us a braita? Nah, Rav Huna matnita lo shmiele. No, actually, Rav Huna hadn't even heard the braita. He came up with the same answer all by himself. Okay, now that's odd, but since he came up with the right answer by himself, we're just going to move on, apparently. Because we're more interested in the next thing that Rav Chisda said as he was sitting there continuing to teach. V'tu yativ Rav Chisda v'ka'amar mishmei denafshe. And Rav Chisda continued to talk, and this time he spoke in his own name. And he said, Hade amarta shinui makom tzarich levarech. When we said that if you change places, you need to make a new bracha, lo amaran ela bidvarim she'ein tunin bracha la'acharehen bimkoman. That was only talking about things that do not require a bracha after them in their place. Now, this is a strange category. We're going to follow Rashi in his reading of it. Rashi says that that things that require a blessing after them in the same place where you ate, that's mizonot and bread. Because if you had been eating bread or mizonot, then when you stood up to go somewhere else, you would have benched, or you would have said an al hamichya before you left if you were done. And if you don't bench or you don't make an al hamichya, then that proves you're planning to come back, and so you don't need to make a new bracha when you come back because you demonstrated from start to finish that you weren't done. You were just getting up and coming back. Whereas if, as Rav Chisda is claiming in this case is the situation, you were eating or drinking something that doesn't require that kind of bracha, where you might make the bracha as you're walking away. It's not clear to me exactly when and where they expect you to make your bracha achrona, but apparently they don't necessarily think that it happens right before you leave. So Rashi says this is water or fruit. So if you were just drinking water, eating fruit, then when you get up and leave, we don't know whether you're planning to come back, so we assume you're not planning to come back, so you need to make a new bracha. Either way, in Rav Chisda's universe, even according to the Braita that said that if you change places, you need to make a new bracha, most of the time, if you're eating a conventional meal, that's not true. It's only true of a relatively narrow category of snacks. So he has redefined the Breita into applying to almost nothing. Okay. Avad dvarim hatunim bracha la'acharihen bimkoman ein tzarich levarech. Just to finish reading what he said, which I stopped in the middle of. But the things that do require a blessing after them in their place, you don't need to bless. Presumably that means a new bracha before continuing to eat, although it may also mean a blessing after them before you stand up. My Tama, why? L'kvia kamad hadar, because he's returning to his original establishment. I mean, he's coming back to he had a formal meal that he was eating, and he has left it, but he's coming back to it. It may also be, although this is not what Rashi says, that with a less formal form of eating, that there's nothing to come back to, because a meal is a thing that you get up and you, I don't know, go get another bowl of soup, or you go to the bathroom, you open the door to let more guests in, whatever, but you're in the middle of this thing and you come back to it because it's a thing that goes on for some period of time and has a formal definition and so on. Whereas drinking a glass of water isn't really something to come back to. It's just a thing that happened. It doesn't really have a social import such that it would be an event. So there may be some of that here too, although that is not what Rashi says.
But Deborah, what if you do go from one house to another?
So we will see. It sounds at this point like Rav Chisda is saying that if you're sitting down and you're eating your, I don't know, sandwich on bread that you washed for, and you stand up in the middle. Certainly, he's saying that if you take your food with you and go sit in somebody else's house to finish eating it, you shouldn't need a new bracha. But I think the somewhat larger chidush that he's saying is that if you stand up, walk away, have a conversation with your neighbor on the street corner, and come back 5 minutes later and sit down again at your table, you don't need a new bracha then either, because you left your meal in the middle and you came back. We're going to modify that further, and that may not be the position we end up with, but at this point, that seems to be what Rav Chisda is saying.
But they're only talking about coming back to the same place, not about going, let's say you meet your neighbor and then you decide to go to your neighbor's.
If you take your food with you, then you might still not need to make a new blessing when you get to the new place. If you don't bring your food with you, then I think it's gonna be very hard to make the claim that you're returning to the same meal.
Right.
That's gonna be a very hard one to process.
Right.
But it ends up kind of muddled, and I'm not sure.
Okay.
In any case, Rav Sheshet said, "Echad zeh ve'echad zeh tzarich levarech." Rav Sheshet said, don't tell me that it's different with different kinds of foods. Doesn't matter. You move somewhere else, you need to make a new blessing. That at least is straightforward. We know what he means, at least. It's something. Okay. And we're going to try another tiyufta. Meitive. B'neicha burashahayam hayu misubin lishtot. We have a group which is reclining to drink. And as Arvei pointed out before all of you got here this evening, or some of you were here, it seems that reclining is simply the normal way to eat formal meals. Although, as I mentioned before, it may be a normal way for noblemen to eat meals, not a normal way for ordinary people too. I don't know exactly how widespread it was. But even for regular people, it might be that it's normal if you're eating a really important celebratory meal, or if you're eating a meal, a Shabbat meal or something like that. In the same way as we have cultural practices that we attach to formal meals, that if you're eating at a state dinner, then if you eat at a lot of state dinners, you might do that every night, wearing a tuxedo and tails while sitting in front of china on a white tablecloth, listening to live music while a waiter waits on you. right? But for some of us, that might be an experience we only have when we're having an unusually special occasion. So it may be that reclining was something along those lines, that it was for some people an everyday event and for other people a special occasion. I don't really know. But it's definitely not um, restricted to Pesach. And the use of it on Pesach seems to be intended to tap into the symbolism that it has normally, which would be more meaningful to us if that it had that symbolism for us. But we live in a society in which reclining is not really part of the regular meal culture. In any case, we have here a group that's reclining to drink. I think the assumption is that they're drinking, but they're also eating, although it does not say so. And they uprooted their feet. They got up to go out and greet a chatan or a kala, a groom or a bride. And there's a procession going past outside, and you want to go outside and wave and sing and clap and say hi, tell the bride she looks beautiful, tell the chatan he looks handsome, whatever things people do. In any case, כשהן יוצאים אינן טעונין ברכה למפרע, כשהן חוזרין אין טעונין ברכה לכתחילה. So when they go outside, they don't need to make a final bracha for the food that they've eaten already. And when they come back inside, they don't need to make a beginning bracha for the food that they're going to continue to eat. Meaning it seems that we're allowing them to get up, go outside, greet the bride and groom, and come back, and we're saying their meal's not interrupted. They can just keep going as if they hadn't left. That seems to contradict Rav Sheshet, right? Rav Sheshet had said it doesn't make any difference what the situation is. If you left, you need to make a new bracha. It actually also seems, possibly, to contradict Rav Chisda, who had made whether or not you need to make a new bracha dependent on what it is you're eating. And here, it doesn't seem to depend on that. It doesn't seem to depend on anything yet, although we're not done reading it. We're still in the middle. But Medvarim Amru. What case are we talking about? Shehinichu zakeno chole. If they left behind an elderly person or a sick person. Avalo hinichu sham zakeno chole. But if they didn't leave behind an elderly person or a sick person, geshehin yotzin tu'unin bracha l'mafreya, geshehin chosrim tu'unin bracha l'chatchila. If everybody actually got up and left, leaving nobody behind, then they do need to bench before they leave, and they do need to make a new bracha when they come back. Now, I want to just interpose for a second and comment that on the one hand, you might be concerned, and I think it would be a reasonable concern, that the leaving behind the weak and vulnerable so that they can feel left out doesn't seem like a kind and appropriate way to behave. Celebration or no celebration. You don't get up and run outside to have fun, leaving grandma behind, unable to get out of her chair. That doesn't seem appropriate. But I do think that look carefully at what just happened. We just made everybody's religious experience depend on grandma. We just gave her, not socially she's left behind, but religiously we just gave grandma the most important role in the family. Because she's the only reason the meal is continuing and that everybody gets to come back to continue eating. And so it may be that we understand they're gonna leave grandma behind, and we're trying to engineer it so that at least grandma has an important role to play in the process. I don't know, maybe. In any case, this seems to make the question of whether you have to make a new bracha dependent not on what you were eating, but on whether everybody left or not everybody left. Which seems actually to be a tiyufta against both Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet said no matter what you need a new bracha. Rav Chisda said whether or not you need a new bracha depends on what you're eating. This seems to be on a totally different axis, and it seems to disagree with both of them. But Rav Chisda's got an answer. Midaktani akru raglehem, since it teaches they uprooted their feet. The fact that we're talking about uprooting your feet must mean your feet were pretty solidly, very firmly established to begin with. That must mean that you were in the middle of doing something really solid and establishing, which must mean you were eating something that's a real meal. You were eating something that requires a blessing afterwards in its place. Maybe, the people in the Gemara are in a better position to know the nuances of the language of the Mishnah or the Braita than I am. Could be. Nonetheless, even though you're eating something that establishes a real meal, the reason why you don't need to make new brachot is because you left behind somebody, the elderly person or the sick person. That's why you don't need new brachot. Aval, but lo hinichu sham zakeno chole kishen yotzin tunin bracha lemafreya kishen chozrin tunin bracha lechatchila. But if you didn't leave anyone behind, even though apparently you are eating something that requires a bracha in its place after, you are still going to need to make a bracha after, and when you come back, you're still going to need to make a new bracha. So the Gemara says kashya le-Rav Chisda. This is a problem for Rav Chisda, which is a gentler language than this is a tiyuvta to Rav Chisda. One popular formulation is that a tiyuvta is not resolvable; it's over. The person has lost. Whereas a kashya, if you worked hard enough, you could find a solution. So it's not necessarily devastating to their position, but at the moment the Gemara doesn't see fit to rescue them. Okay, so it seems like Rav Chisda's position that it depends on what kind of food you were eating is mostly disproven. Mostly dead.
Is Rav Chisda a Tana or an Amora?
Rav Chisda is an Amora. The title Rav hasn't been invented yet during the time period of the Tanaim. So anybody who's named Rav is automatically an Amora because as I said, that title hasn't been invented yet in the time of the Mishnah. People with the title Rabbi can go either way, and you need to know who they are, or sometimes you can tell from the context of the Gemara.
Got it, thanks.
Okay. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. I'm Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Man Tana Akirot. So Nachman bar Yitzchak wants to know who wrote the Braita that we just quoted about uprooting your feet. And his answer is it must be Rabbi Yehuda. Detanya, because he has a Braita from Rabbi Yehuda. Chaverim shahayu misubim v'akru raglehem leilech lebeit hakneset o lebeit hamidrash. So this is a very similar Braita. We have a group of people a group of friends who are reclining, and then they uprooted their feet to go to shul or to the Beit Midrash. Kishahin yotzin ein tunin bracha lemafreya, kishahin chozrim ein tunin bracha lechatchila. And the law is the same here as we said with the group that was going to greet the bride or the groom before. When they leave, they don't need to bench first, and when they come back, they don't need to make a new bracha.
And this is not dependent on what they were eating and whether it required a bracha after it or not.
It seems that it's the same as the last Braita, that it really just depends on, well, it doesn't say that it depends on leaving someone behind here. It doesn't say what it depends on, actually, according to the first position. It might be that it also depends on leaving somebody behind. It might also hypothetically be that there's a difference between going to a Beit Knesset or Beit Midrash and going to greet a bride and groom, that, I don't know, you leave for a different amount of time, or we want to encourage one or the other more than the other, or you're likely to eat while you're at one place or the other. It seems to me there are a variety of different things that could be different between them. So I don't want to say that it's exactly the same, but if it's similar, then it seems that it doesn't make it depend on anything. That
Right,
it's
just the language of akru raglehem
just
is the same.
you don't need a new bracha. What?
Sorry, just the language of akru raglehem is the same, and we already established that in the previous Breita, it meant that they were in the middle of eating something that did require a bracha. So here with the same language, you might make the same assumption, though it's not
You might.
implicit.
But that would, so maybe, yes, it could be. The first position here, you're right, it may depend on what you're eating. It does not seem to depend on whether you left anyone behind, though, because it doesn't mention that, and Rabbi Yehuda is going to in his disagreement with it.
Right,
His
right.
dissent, I guess we should call it. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, b'med dvarim omrim bizman shehinichu sham miktzat chaverim. Rabbi Yehuda said that's only true, this thing about not needing a new bracha, if you left some people behind. Aval lo hinichu sham miktzat chaverim, but if you didn't leave some friends behind, then kishehen yotzin tunin bracha lemafreya, when they go out, they need a bracha, they need to bench. Kishehen chosrin tunin bracha lechatchila, when they come back, they're going to need to make a new bracha. So it seems like Rabbi Yehuda is consistent with our previous position. It's now just some friends that are being left behind. He doesn't make any reference to them being old or sick, but maybe that was just a guess as to why you would leave people behind. Maybe it's not, maybe it doesn't mean anything, technically. Elatana de bidvarim hatu'unim bracha la'acharehen bimkoman, de kishehen yotzin ein tu'unim bracha l'mafreya, kishehen chozrin ein tu'unim bracha l'mafreya. And so we're inferring, as Mindy said, that we're talking about food that needs a bracha after it in its place, and when they go out, they don't need a bracha after, and when they come back, they don't need a bracha before. But things that don't require a bracha after them in their place, afilu l'rabanan kishen yotzin tu'unin bracha l'mafreya u'kishen chozrin tu'unin bracha l'chatchila. But even the rabbis, when they go out, you need to bench, and when you come back, you don't need to bench. So you don't need to when you come back, you do need to make a bracha. So now they suggest, bizarrely, lema tehave tiyufta the Rabbi Yochanan. So let's say that this is a tiyufta to the position of Rabbi Yochanan that I said to hold on to from half an hour ago. That Rabbi Yochanan said that if you change places, you don't need to make a new bracha on your wine. And here it seems to be saying that for something that doesn't require a blessing after it in its place, and we seem to assume that wine is in that category, then everybody here thinks that you would need to make a new bracha. So sorry, Rabbi Yochanan, you've disagreed with everybody. That's a tiyufta to you. You lose. But the Gemara says, wait a minute. Didn't we already tiyufta Rabbi Yochanan? Because I remember doing that half an hour ago. Nema mehanami to have a tiyufta. Okay, so I won't say let this be a tiyufta. I'll say let this be another tiyufta against him. But it gets weirder. Amar l'cha Rabbi Yochanan. So if Rabbi Yochanan were here, he would defend himself to you. And this is also not especially unusual in the Gemara, where we write defenses to dead people, that if the dead person were here, this is what they would say to you to defend themselves, and we let them speak at great length, even though as far as we can tell, they were already dead when the lines were written. Okay, but this is what Rabbi Yochanan would say to defend himself had he been alive when the Gemara was being written. Hu hadin ta'afilu dvarim she'ein tunin bracha la'acharehen bimkoman nami ein tzrichim levarich. So he says, It's also true that even things that don't require a bracha after them in their place you don't need to make a new bracha. V'had diktani akru raglehen l'hodiaha kochod Rabbi Yehuda. And when it said they uprooted their feet, that's the piece that implied that we were talking about food that you have to make a blessing after it in its place. That was to show you the strength of Rabbi Yehuda. Da'afilu dvarim shetunim bracha lacharehem bimkoman tama dehinichu miktzat chavirim. That even the things that do need a blessing after them in their place, the only reason Rabbi Yehuda isn't making you make a new bracha is because you left behind friends. But if you didn't leave behind friends, then then when you went out, you would have had to bench, and when you came back, you would have had to make a new bracha. Now,
So
why
is that a strength of Rabbi Yehuda?
Okay. So here's the thing. If Rabbi Yehuda has a very strongly you must leave friends behind position, such that even if the kind of food you were eating is the kind of food that we would be sympathetic to your not making new brachot with, even then, unless you left friends behind, you're still going to have to make new brachot. Okay, so if we had said this position about a glass of wine or a glass of milk or a glass of water, we would have said, well, I mean, yeah, nobody's going to let you leave and come back and not make a new bracha on that. And so we wouldn't have been terribly surprised that if you don't leave friends behind, you have to make a new bracha. But if he says you can't have to make a new bracha unless you left friends behind, even if you were eating bread, that's a very strong, extreme position. And what's happened here is something that's pretty common. You have a dispute in which covers a range of situations, and the lenient position is surprising at one end of that spectrum, and the stringent position is surprising at the other end of the spectrum. And if they only disagree about exactly one case, then it's easy to decide which case to write the text about, because you just write it about the one case they disagree about. But if they disagree about the whole range, then if you describe the case as the case in the middle, then you end up not knowing how anybody feels about the extreme positions. If you describe the case at one end of the spectrum, then now you know the position of the people whose position surprised you at that end of the spectrum, but you don't really understand fully the position of the other people, and vice versa. So, yes, sometimes a Braita or a Mishnah will actually explicate the whole range of cases that someone's talking about, but most of the time not. Most of the time it chooses one case to give positions about. And then you have to figure out to what extent the people are also talking about all the other possible cases. And this is one possible outcome, which is to say they chose an extreme case. They chose the case in which people were eating stuff that would be a real meal, in order to show you how extreme Rabbi Yehuda's position is, saying that you have to make new brachot unless you left friends behind. But they only chose that case to show you the extreme of Rabbi Yehuda's position. It doesn't tell you anything about the other position. The other position thinks that you get up, walk around, come back, don't make a new bracha, no matter what you were eating or who you left behind or really anything else. So Rabbi Yochanan can claim that that's how he was reading the whole series of Braitot about the people who got up to go do something and came back. And that would rehabilitate Rabbi Yochanan. That would untiyuv to him, because at that point he could claim to be agreeing with whoever it is that's disagreeing with Rabbi Yehuda here, they don't have a name, so the Gemara is calling them Rabbanan. We can call them Rabbanan too, the rabbis. So if Rabbi Yochanan is ruling like that position, that's a totally legitimate Tannaitic position. And although we have declared tiyufta against Rabbi Yochanan twice this evening, it would seem, in fact, that we've just untiyufted him, and he's just been rehabilitated. Rav Chisda's position is still a little bit in trouble, because while we have a position that says you never need to make a new bracha if you move from one place to another, and we have a position that says that if you were eating a full meal with bread or mizonot and you got up leaving some people behind and then came back, you don't need to make new brachot. We don't have a position that makes it contingent only on what you were eating, which was Rav Chisda's position. So Rav Chisda is still a little bit in trouble. So let's rescue him too. And then that will be the end of the Gemara for this year. Okay. Tanya kavatei Rav Chisda, chaverim shehayu mesubim lishtot yain, va'akru raglehen, v'chazru, ein tzrichin levarech. So a Braita supporting Rav Chisda. So we untiyuvted Rabbi Yochanan. Now we are going to unkashya, I guess, Rav Chisda, because we found a Braita agreeing with him also. Friends who were reclining to drink wine, v'akru raglehen v'chazru, and they uprooted their feet. And so following the rest of this interpretation, I guess we're going to assume that uprooted their feet means they were eating a meal. And then they came back, ein tzrichin levarech. They do not need to make blessings, and it doesn't make any other distinctions. So if we believe that akru raglehen means that they were eating hamotzi or mizonot, then this is exactly what Rav Chisda is looking for. It says they don't need to make new blessings. It does make reference to having a formal meal, and it doesn't seem to care whether or not you left people behind. So in the end, we have rehabilitated all of the positions. Everybody is still a possibility, and in a sense, we're more muddled going out than we were going in, because with all possible positions being legitimate, that leaves us a little unclear where to go next. But that's okay. We are often come out of the Gemara muddled about what the halacha is. That's pretty normal. Okay, so just stopping the screen share just to go back over a couple of things that we did this evening. We saw the idea of tiyufta when an Amora has apparently disagreed with the positions of the Tanaim and gets disproven. We saw that we usually rescue the Amora, although usually we rescue them without first decreeing them to be trounced. We saw this, we chose this case in order to show you the strength of so-and-so's position, but it doesn't tell you anything about the other position. We saw that form of argument, which is also a very important form of argument. And we also saw the kind of nested form of the Gemara, in which we keep going off on a tangent on something which is related but not quite the same thing, and then coming back to this machloket between Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, which is kind of always there in the background, and we go off on our little excursions to discuss other things, but we keep popping back to it again. Okay, does anybody have anything to say?
So is that the end of this thread? Is the Gemara going to go on to something else totally?
End is such a strong word. I don't, not completely.
Because it really does come back and loop around constantly. You could get confused.
Yeah, the Gemara does that a lot.
Yeah.
And we are gonna, we're actually going now to loop back around to the problem of people who are sitting and eating when Shabbat starts, because the world wasn't confusing enough yet.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. And all of the pieces are interconnected, but they're not linear.
Right, right. So how did we leave? We left it with Pores Mapa Mikadesh, right? That's how we left it last time.
That is how we left it. Although that we left it that there's a machloket, but that's the position we rule like.
Right. So we're going to go loop back around to that.
We're going back there, and eventually, in another couple of weeks, we will even come back around to the Seder itself, which is where we're going.
Excellent.
And at that point, we will go through the Haggadah, such as it was in the time of the Mishnah, in great detail.
Oh, good. Terrific.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I will see you next Monday night.
Thank you.
And have a lovely evening.
You too.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.
Night.